Hey guys, today we're going to be reviewing how to convert between decimals, fractions, and percents. You should have learned this last year, but just a quick refresher as we go into our next subjects. So converting between decimals, fractions, and percents. All right, so this will be a good reference page for you in your notebook. I'll give you like the steps for converting for each type and one example. So the first type would be going from a decimal to a fraction. So when we go from a decimal to a fraction, the first step would be to move the decimal two places to the right. And once you do that, you're going to write that number over 100. Okay, and then the final step will be to reduce that fraction if possible. Okay, so for an example of that, let's do 0.35. So the first step says move decimal two places to the right. So I would take that decimal and move it two places. That's step one. Okay, then I would take that new number, which is 35 now, and place it over 100. So that was step two. And then step three would be to reduce if possible. And I can see both these numbers could be divided by 5. So when I reduce, that would be 7 over 20. So that would be step 3 there, the reducing. Okay, the next kind that we will have steps for is going from a decimal to a percent. Okay, first step there is going to be just the same as the other one. Move the decimal two places to the right. And then for our second step, we're going to just write the percent sign. Oops. Behind this new number. Okay, so let's look at an example of that. Say we had 0.63 as our decimal. Our first step is move the decimal two places to the right. That'd be step one. And step two is write a percent sign behind this new number. So our new number is 63. And that would be our step two. All right, so now we're going to do going from a fraction to a decimal. Okay, here we're just going to divide the numerator by the denominator. And if those words confuse you, remember the numerator is the number on top and the denominator is the one on the bottom. Okay, so for an example, if we had the fraction 6/8, we would solve this by dividing the top number by the bottom number. Make sure you get the order correct. 6 divided by 8, and that would give us 0.75. So now we would have a decimal. All right. The next one that we need to know how to do is going from a fraction to a percent. And if you think about it, we're just going to be converting the fraction to a decimal like we did here, and then taking a decimal to a percent. So it's kind of combining these two. Okay, so our first step would be to divide the numerator by the denominator. So the same thing we did here, turn our fraction to a decimal. And then once we have a decimal, we're going to move the decimal two places to the right. And finally, we're going to write that percent sign. Behind the number. Okay, so let's do an example of that. Say I had the fraction 5/8. I would start by dividing numerator by denominator, so 5 divided by 8, and that gives me 0.625. Then my second step is to move the decimal two places to the right. So it would go right there. So now I would have 62.5. And my final step is to write that percent sign at the end. All right, got two more. We're going to do now percent to decimal. Okay, when we go percent to decimal, we're going to this time move the decimal two places to the left. Okay, if there's no decimal, if you don't see a decimal, remember that there's always that invisible one to the right of the number. So remember it's to the right of the number. Okay, so let's look at an example. So say I have 75%. I'm going to take the decimal, which we don't see one here, right? So it's got to be just to the right, and move it two places to the left. So that would be 0.75 for my new decimal. All right, and finally, we're going to do percent to a fraction. Okay, so here for step 1, if it's a whole number that you're given, write that number over 100 like a fraction. Okay, if it's not a whole number, I want you to first do the same thing, write it over 100. And you're going to multiply the fraction top and bottom by 10 for every decimal place. And that'll get rid of that decimal. We'll do an example here in a sec so you can see. Okay, and then finally, reduce your fraction if possible. All right, so like I said, we're going to do an example here. So say I was given 0.5%. It's not a whole number, it has a decimal. So I'm still going to write it over 100, 0.5 over 100. But now I'm going to multiply by 10 for every decimal place. Since this has one decimal place, I'm going to multiply by 10. And I need to do the same thing to the top and to the bottom. Okay, so that would give me 5 over 1,000. And then my final step is reduce if possible. I can see that these both can be divided by 5. So my final answer would be 1 over 200. All right, so we're going to do some try on your own real quick so that you can practice applying the rules. Remember, these are your reference, so look back at your notes as needed, okay? So let's do the first one. Remember, you're going to copy all these down, pause the video, and then we'll go over them together. So number 1 is going to be to convert 27.5% to a decimal. Leave yourself a little space to work. Number 2 is going to be to convert 45 over 60 to a percent. Okay. Number 3 is going to be to convert 9.8 to a fraction. Okay, number 4 is convert 14 over 45 to a decimal. Number 5 is convert 0.084 to a percent. And finally, number 6 is to convert, oops, did I mess up? There, it's on the other page. All right, convert 25.4% to a fraction. All right, guys, pause the video here, try them, and then we'll come back and go over them together. All right, so hopefully you did that and you're coming back to the top. So here we're going from a percent to a decimal. So make sure you look at your notes for percent to decimal. It says move decimal 2 places to the left. So if I go here, my decimal is here, I'm going to move it 2 places to the left. So my new decimal is 0.275. Okay, for number 2, I'm going from a fraction to a percent. So pull up your notes, fraction to percent, divide numerator by denominator. So I would do 45 divided by 60. When I put that in my calculator, I get 0.75. Then it says move the decimal 2 places to the right. So I'm going to go ahead and move that 1, 2. So that's going to be 75. And then I'm going to write my percent sign behind it. So this would be 75%. Okay, here I'm going from a decimal to a fraction. So check your notes out. Move decimal 2 places to the right, write that number over 100 and reduce. So 2 places to the right, that's 1, 2. I'm going to have to add a 0, so that's 980 now. Write it over 100 and then reduce if possible. I'm seeing they both end in 0. I'm going to quickly divide by 10 to get them to smaller numbers. So that would be 98 over 10. And then I see they're both even, so I'm going to divide by 2. Get that even smaller. And that would be 49 over 5. And now notice it's an improper fraction. The top number is larger than the bottom number. So remember to convert those, I need to divide. So if I do 49 divided by 5, that goes in 9 times with a remainder of 4. So that's 9 whole times, that's my whole number. And then I have 4/5 left over. So my final answer would be 9 4/5. Remember, we have notes on fractions at the very beginning of your interactive notebook from the beginning of the year if you need a refresher on that. All right, here we're going from a fraction to a decimal. Remember, that one just means divide the numerator by the denominator. So just like when we did expressions and equations, that fraction bar is just a division sign. So this means 14 divided by 45. And when you put that in your calculator, you're going to get 0.31111 forever. Remember to write that. You're going to write 0.31 and put a bar over just the 1. That tells us that the 1 keeps repeating, not the 3, but just the 1. Okay? All right, now we're going from a decimal to a percent. Our directions say move decimal 2 places to the right and then write the percent sign. So 2 places to the right, this becomes 8.4, and then we put our percent sign. Okay, percent means per 100, literally. So putting that percent sign there means that we're dividing it by 100. If I divide that by 100, I go back to my original decimal. All right, and our final one, convert this percent to a fraction. So if it's a whole number, write it over 100. It is not. If it's not a whole number, write it over 100 and multiply by 10 for every decimal place. So let's do that. We've got 25.4 over 100 and then multiply by 10 for every decimal place. I see 1 decimal place, so I'm going to multiply by 10. Remember, do that to the top and the bottom. That's going to give me 254 over 1,000. And then reduce if you can. I see that they're both even, so I'm going to divide them both by 2 to get smaller numbers that are easier to work with. And I get 127 over 500. These are not both even. I don't quickly see a number that they can both be divided by. I think we are done. All right, so your practice today is again just applying these rules. So as long as you can identify what you're working with, decimal percent, percent fraction, fraction decimal, etc., then just follow the directions in your notes and you should be good. Let me know if you have any trouble.